So I'm going to primarily we're going to be using the second handout today. But I did want to mention one thing in the previous one, which is the question about slavery and what Rousseau says about slavery in the original state of nature. He says that slavery can't exist in that state. Do you remember why? Why is slavery impossible in the natural state? It makes a difference as far as later on when he explains the development of slavery, why it's just flat out impossible in the primitive conditions of original man.
Because you couldn't in a good way keep them there and keep them under your control, basically, because people can rebel. They can say, no, I'm not going to do that, and you can do everything in your power to try to make them do that, but they still have the option to not do it.
Yeah, and they have that option because you literally can't force them at that point, because you just remember how primitive these people are. They don't have technology at all. They don't have weapons other than their own physical bodies at first. And so they literally can't control anybody. They can't tie them up. They can't point a gun at them, or a sword, because metallurgy, which comes in later, it doesn't even exist. They don't know how to make metal. And so, it's a similar argument to why he says they can't accumulate property. In the original state, they can't accumulate property because there's just only so much that they can possibly handle. So they're not even going to take any territory. They're just roaming, basically. And as far as what they eat, even if we're talking about semi-perishable things like nuts and apples and things like that, there's only so many that they can possibly have before it spoils or before somebody else comes along and grabs it.
So they can't feed another slave? Yeah.
No, they really can't. So, all they can really do is feed themselves.
He's taken more of a, since you don't have the tools or the necessary things to allow for slavery, then it's not possible.
Right.
Okay.
It's physically not possible. And so it wouldn't have occurred to people in that primitive state. Okay? That becomes important later on as he explains, well, how do we then get slavery? How do we get to the point where people dominate each other like that? And it's through a series of physical changes, you might say technological changes that happen that make it possible. And mentality changes as well. So we'll get back to that as we move through the second part of the discourse. Couple of terms, and these are both referenced in your handout, the second handout, that Rousseau pretty much invented. I know for sure that he invented egocentrism, and I'm pretty sure he invented socialization. If he didn't, he was one of the very first people to use the term. And of course, those are very important terms that we still use today. Socialization is the concept of people learning and teaching each other certain ways, right? You socialize a person to be this way or that way. In this case, he's writing about teaching inequality, that, as people develop into communities, which we will discuss, how this happens, but they begin to socialize and socialize each other. And so you get these ways of life that are justified and promoted and so forth. So that's, in his view, totally artificial. Socialization is totally artificial. And it can vary from place to place and time to time. The other term, egocentrism or amour propre, it's an unusual distinction that he makes between amour propre, and I know I'm not pronouncing that exactly right, but it means something like vanity or self-esteem. It's a love of oneself, but a love of oneself through other people's eyes. So it's the idea that, I like myself because I've got money and I've got more money than other people, and so they admire me. Or, I'm I'm good looking, so other people look at me differently, and that's why I love myself. Okay, so that's why I say it's closer to vanity. Okay, whereas he also says there's something called amour de soi, which is love of oneself, which is natural and normal and okay. Love of oneself is just the natural state that even people in the original state of nature had, where they just prefer themselves to other people and things. As in, my hunger is most important, my comfort is most important. Okay? Doesn't mean that I don't care about others, but it's just the way it is. That's only natural. But it doesn't involve, I like myself because that person over there can't run as fast as me. Yeah, that comparison type of thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Okay. So it wouldn't be translated selfishness. Selfishness is more associated with just, I want more stuff. Okay? This is vanity, pride. Just about every political philosopher ends up coming out against pride. Okay? The reason why amour propre is bad is because it just creates conflict.
Is there any philosopher that takes the pride argument?
Yeah, Nietzsche does.
Nietzsche does, okay.
And to a certain extent his predecessor Hegel does. And they both, Hegel would say it's a natural human trait to have this pride and this desire, he says, for recognition from other people. Mm-hmm. And this is what drives people to try to achieve equality, actually, in his view. Okay, so it's what drives history. And of course, Hegel's philosophy gets taken up by Marx, but Marx dumps the self-recognition or the desire for recognition part. And then Nietzsche takes it up and really kind of radicalizes it. He rejects Hegel's view that it drives history. He certainly rejects the idea that it leads to equality.
She's just so different.
Yeah. Nietzsche wants there to be, there's certain people that are just naturally better and more, or are superior to others, and those people should do what they want, and they should and do love themselves in that way, and that is totally natural in his view. So, there's two, but from the liberals, all rejected.
Don't the ancients, because particularly I thought that in 300 we talked about how way before Christianity came about, they kind of talked about pride, but then
yeah, right. There's that idea of magnanimity and honor that comes from the ancient world. Magnanimity is the idea that you are superior in some way, and you should basically live that way, and it's okay to be admired for those traits. You should be generous with the traits and the abilities and the assets that you have.
That's interesting, because you mentioned Christianity. Would you argue then that the establishment of religion such as Christianity could have been the downfall of that prideful thinking?
Yeah, actually you're absolutely right. That's the sort of the very core reason why this started to change. And liberalism is heavily influenced by Christianity, right? With the idea of all individuals being valuable, everybody equal, and so forth. And pride became a sin. And so, it's not a coincidence that in the development of liberal thought, it tends to be seen in that way. It's a source of conflict. And this is part of the problem for the concept of honor. That's why we're trying to figure out, can honor exist in a liberal society? Is because most liberal political thought rejects pride and the idea of, getting esteem from other people and ranking them and so forth, and honor is all about that. It survived in Europe because of the sort of side-by-side or parallel tradition of chivalry, which partly absorbed Christianity but partly did not. It never did completely do that because it admired warfare and, valor and, taking of prisoners, all sorts of things that pure Christian thought wouldn't countenance or would see as sinful. So these two kind of coexisted and interacted to a limited extent. And then with the development of liberal thought, as the European economy began to change, chivalry just went by the wayside, that whole tradition. But But a lot of liberal thinkers thought that Christianity or Judeo-Christianity would persist in European society and would substitute for these more primitive motivations for self-control and having a code of conduct and that kind of thing. But liberalism erodes religion as well. So this is the problem for, contemporary thinkers, is what do you do in a post-religious world? And I'm not saying that everybody in our society is an atheist, but it's becoming less of a driving force for people's daily behavior. So in that case, is there some way to bring honor back in? That's what we're grappling with, and make it compatible with liberalism. Rousseau comes from a very different position in a lot of ways than Hobbes or Locke, and yet he has a very similar rejection of this idea of pride. And if you reject what he calls vanity or self-esteem, it's very difficult to have a code of honor, since honor deals with partly, 50% of honor is people giving you honor, recognizing your, special ability or talent or quality somehow. And if you can't do that, then it's difficult to perpetuate it if it simply becomes an individual motivation. You can't have a code. Okay, so, all right, so those are two very important concepts just to keep in mind. In the second part, Rousseau goes from this very animalistic state where human beings are hardly different from primates to human beings having consciousness. Consciousness meaning understanding that you exist and that you will live and you will die, that kind of thing, okay? And he says that at first, human beings experience only their own existence, okay? And on a momentary, moment-by-moment basis, just like animals, and that the ego does not exist, literally.
That
Okay.
doesn't line up with what we know about, baby science.
Yeah?
Because it's all about, their instinct to survive. It's they have their needs.
Right away.
Right?
Yeah, you're right. That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. They do seem to immediately demand. Although, is that just, crying because it's painful to be hungry? And then, of course, they cry and they get a response, and then they learn, maybe it starts that early, though, that they learn, hey, I can manipulate my world in this way, right? So are you saying that science says that consciousness develops pretty early because of that?
Well, that's true. That's fair, because I don't know. I don't know about baby science. But if they are aware of, if it's a conscious, if I cry, then I get things. But it's conditioned responses, in dogs.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So you could maybe.
It could be. Yeah. It could be like that, Pavlovian, right?
Yeah.
In which case, the baby doesn't have consciousness. When did I first see that in my son? Pretty early on, I would say 1.5, something like that. It's when they first start, when I perceived it to be happening is about the time that he could do something beyond crying, right? Try to say a word. Well, for sure they've got some sort of individual consciousness when they can say the other, they can say mama or dada. My son spoke late. He didn't say anything until about 1.5 years, and then he jumped right to a sentence. It's the weirdest damn thing in the world. But he started to try around 1, and when they start to say your name, then you know that they know the difference between you and them. So I guess, but is that because we've been talking to them the whole time, right? It probably is. I've been talking to him, reading to him. I've been calling him by name. I've been saying my name. So imagine people without any of that. Nobody's talking, okay? Nobody has speech yet. It would maybe take more than that, so that these cries would just be more instinctual. I think that's the way he sees it anyway. And of course, we can only know so much, right? Because we can't get into their heads.
So what do you mean, or what does he mean, I guess? This kind of confuses me, that the ego comes from comparison. Is that just like saying like what you just said, like
Well,
with your son, like
we have
this
to
is you and this is who I
No,
am?
it's more than that. The more appropriate comes much later. The love of self might come at that stage,
Okay.
right? Very early. Probably you could even say Rousseau would say those cries are an example of love of self. You know, from the very beginning, you prefer yourself, and any discomfort you have is going to be what you're concerned about, whether you can say anything about it or not. But self-esteem type love is something that you only get once people have developed speech and civilization.
Okay.
So we'll go through the steps involved.
Okay.
I remember last time we did mention, you know, what drives people into some sort of society where they cooperate, at least temporarily, is these natural disasters. That's what he says. I've always found that to be kind of a little problematic. It seems kind of convenient in a way, but because there's always going to be problems. First time I learned this, I thought, well, did he think that natural disasters and difficulties happen less often back in some primordial state than they happen now? 'Cause
Ask the dinosaurs.
yeah, right. It happens all the
It
time.
just seems like he's just taking the easy way out with this to me.
Just
You
maybe
know,
a little
like-
convenient.
Yeah, you know, like I think there's other reasons for people to combine forces, I guess, to start a society than just disaster related.
Well, we see that, you know, both Hobbes and Locke, particularly Locke,
Mhm.
is good at this, says that there's lots of reasons
Yeah.
that it just makes sense that we're, in fact, fairly sociable, and it occurs to us that we
It's
would...
made the most sense.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So that would be the type of thought to sort of put up against what Rousseau
Seems we're
is
kind of like
saying.
going on an extreme scale. Like Hobbes is extreme, Locke is in the middle, and
Yeah, Locke is in the middle, you're
Rousseau's
right.
just too laxed with it.
Yeah.
That's true, you're right. So, yeah, so I guess let's just take him at his word at this point that these disasters which happen, you know, give people the experience of having to be in closer proximity and having to at least temporarily cooperate. And they push people to invent maybe clothing, tools to protect themselves. And with these tools, these primitive tools that they develop, then they realize, oh, I can kill. And at first they kill animals, so they now can hunt. And they're not just out there trying to grab a fish or something like that. There's a whole sport on that, by the way. There's guys that go into...
Noodling.
Yes, right. And
What's
they
it
just,
called?
they hunker
Noodling.
down and...
You go and basically you're fishing with your hand, so
Mm-hmm.
a fish will come up and you know almost swallow your whole entire arm, and you pick it up.
Oh.
Big catfish, I think, right? They get
Catfish,
underneath.
and then just really really big
So
fish
you
that you
stick
can't
your
really.
hand out and
You
then...
stick like you've got. I think you have some kind of bait in your hand, and it gives out a smell or whatever in the water, and the fish will come up to eat it, and it'll take your whole hand, and you just grab it and yank.
Oh my God.
Yeah, noodling is what it's called.
Yeah.
Don't do it with sea fish. That's freshwater fish.
Fish with teeth, no. But, like a catfish
Or
doesn't
bats.
have, it has
Bats.
little tiny teeth, doesn't it? Little itty bitty tiny.
Yeah, all
But they
fish have
wouldn't.
teeth, but they're not going to be like jaws.
They're not going to hurt you. Yeah, right. Well, maybe hurt a little bit. So I guess what I'm saying is people could catch fish even before they had spears or anything if they were really smart or really fast. But probably most mammals they couldn't catch. Occasionally you might be able to catch something, but if you're just running and trying to grab hold of it, which by the way I did over spring break, my sister's dog got away, and it was one of these runners. She told me ahead of time. She says it's not coming back. If it ever gets out, it's not coming back.
Oh,
And I felt really bad. So the dog gets out, and I took off my sandals and I started running. And I leaped on that sucker. It was like 2 blocks down. I felt just like one of these people. I've never leaped on anything before in my life. I launched into the air and I came down on that little sucker, and he went. And I thought, wow, I have accomplished something today. And then I hauled his ass back with one hand. So, I mean, it can be done, although I think that probably most animals are faster than that little dog. So, with tools, they get the ability to do more sophisticated hunting, you might say. And with this type of thing, both, I mean, I'm adding clothing here because, frankly, I do want these people to get dressed, but but with clothing and with these weapons, you get some, you're going to notice, right? Mm-hmm. Some people can use them better or make them better. There would be people who would know how to carve their arrowheads better. People who can make an axe better.
So roles kind of start to be developed. Yeah.
Right, roles start to develop.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's a better argument than disasters.
Yeah.
It's a pretty simple one, like accessible to, like, well,
Yes,
we can't
I'd
really
say
protect
it's
it.
almost like that, like once people start cooperating and, you know, they cooperate a couple of different times because, you know, natural disasters come around more than once. After they see, oh, it's easier to cooperate than it is to go tackle a bear. Why would I want to go, you know, risk just my life when it would be a whole lot easier if a whole bunch of us. Yeah, and there's less of a chance of danger.
Yeah.
We've got, you know, the woolly mammoth now can be killed by a group of maybe 10 guys with spears and knives and things like that, and it becomes doable, right? So, but the natural disasters have to be there to give people that idea, that in his mind, because he doesn't want to make them social to start with. That's it. I mean, as far as I can see.
I find that really odd. I guess primitive man may be different, but like if you take just a man or a person and like or a baby for that matter, and you don't do anything to them, like they've done psychological studies on this, it's very, very bad for their psychological state.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to see how that's
neglected. Babies can have real psychological problems. You're right. Yeah.
So it's weird. Like, where does the line get drawn between when man is now required to be social for his health versus not?
Well, you know, maybe in insisting that people were originally completely non-social, he's just going too far. You know, that is something that you can't quite support. The fact that he has to do this maneuver to somehow get them together it seems a little artificial, in the same way that Hobbes' solution seems artificial. You know, how do you take these radically individualistic and antisocial people and somehow get them to make a contract with each other, just out of total fear? More likely, at least Rousseau is a little bit more realistic. He says when people see somebody that they might not want, that they might be afraid of, they just run away. You know, you would think in Hobbes' state that would be the more natural reaction to fear of violent death. I got to get out of here, not, oh, let's form a committee, you know. So it does make you wonder, just using your imagination, you know, maybe human beings are not that asocial or antisocial. For people like Rousseau, they have to argue that social part developed into us as time went by, and maybe they would explain what you're talking about by saying at this point in time we have more or less evolved, you know, through our own socialization to the point where this is expected, or, you know, this has become a necessity. However, when it comes to babies, there's a real problem there, isn't there? Because when they come out, they haven't learned anything yet. And they don't learn very much for a while. I mean, I don't think so. So, yet what we find is that babies, even if they're neglected in the first few months of their life, can have psychological problems, as though they need it at a biological level. They need to have this, you know, closeness and touching and all of that stuff and talking to. So, you know, I don't think that this is terribly supportable. I don't know how you would really scientifically prove that at one time people were completely unsocial. Primates are social. You know, they're both social and antisocial, but mainly, you know, they form communities, and they have hierarchies, and I guess chimpanzees, they even go so far as to have sort of quasi-governments in war. They like go on the attack against other chimpanzee tribes. And so I don't know, but
Like the only primate that would even halfway support this would be the orangutans, which they are antisocial. Like they don't deal with each other. Like,
each other.
But the child, like the baby, does interact with the mother for, you know, a while before it leaves. Like it's
Okay.
They do stay together, and then eventually the kid will leave. But
So the father just goes off immediately.
yeah.
The mother and child stay together until the child can deal with life on its own.
Mm-hmm. So
And-
that's like the only instance of, I guess, really in nature that I could see that, because like even with other like outside primate species,
Mhm.
like with wolf packs, they've got a social thing that they do. You know,
Yeah.
birds even have.
Right?
So it's like weird that.
Yeah, and that's something
That-
Aristotle noticed about a lot of animals thousands of years before Rousseau. So you wonder why does he do this? Well, it probably isn't for a total lack of observation, but maybe he just wants to make his point this way. Maybe he wants to make a fairly extreme point to get people's attention. Maybe he wants to argue, and I do think he does want to argue, that because human beings should be seen as originally not social, and when you get socialization, it's completely artificial, that means that you can socialize people any way you want. And that's where he ends up going in the social contract. That might be part of the reason why he does this. You know, socialization is completely artificial, so therefore we can re-socialize people so that they don't behave in these negative ways and, you know, are peaceable and so forth. So, I don't know. I mean, but it doesn't necessarily excuse the lack of realism at this point. You said that it was easier for you to understand when he gets to the point of when, you know, people making comparisons on the basis of their increasing abilities with technology. With technology, it would accentuate the differences, see, because some people will always be better than others at using every tool. You know, their eye-hand coordination will be better, their intelligence comes into play more and more. The more intelligent the person is, the more they can plan and design and so forth. So the differences become much more noticeable amongst people, and then they begin to make these open comparisons. He says on 396 over on the left, this repeated appropriation of various beings to himself, that would be animals, I guess, and some beings to others. What would that be? I'm not sure, actually. I never understood that particular
What does he
thing.
mean by that?
Some beings to others.
Like
There's
cheetah to like a hyena.
maybe, yeah, okay. The intra-species comparisons.
Would
That
that
could
be like a mother to a kid, because there is like a biological thing of moms.
If it was interpreted as
child.
giving something to another human being, yeah.
Yeah,
It could
so
be
like the mom
interpreted
caring
either
for
way.
a child, even though it's not really like a thing for the mother or
Mhm.
a biological necessity for the mom.
In which case, you know, she could appropriate things or beings to supply the child. But it could also mean what you're saying too. Might be interesting to go back to the original French, but usually French is translated fairly easily, and Rousseau's French isn't terribly complex. There's a few places in here where it's just kind of hard to know for sure what he means. So anyway, he says, must naturally have engendered in man's mind the perception of certain relations. These relations, which we express by the words large, small, strong, weak, fast, slow, timorous, which means fearful, bold, and other similar ideas compared when needed and almost without thinking about it, finally produced in him a kind of reflection, or rather a mechanical prudence, which pointed out to him the precautions that were most necessary for his safety. So this is before words. So he's saying not that people came up with these words, but that they're beginning to think this way. Okay, so there's some thought before words. We talked a little bit about that last time. It's a very primitive thought. You notice, I'm smaller than this other person, or this person's faster, or this person has killed more animals. You know, So you start to think a little bit and have some reflection, and at least by this point you've got an idea definitely of me and them. So there comes your self-consciousness, okay? And it comes in a negative way right away, self-consciousness, because I'm not, of course there's nobody out there that's better than everybody at everything. So you're gonna feel some lack right away. And it doesn't feel particularly good. So then he explains sex roles. Originally, he actually says that men and women in the total state of nature were roughly equal in their physical capabilities because they were just much more strong, just as like Plato pointed out, male and female dogs pretty much bite and run the same, so did male and female. Now, he explains the division of labor that makes for the stronger man and the weaker female like this. He says, at the bottom left of 397, each family became a little society, all the better united because mutual attachment and liberty were its only bonds. And it was then that the first difference was established in the lifestyle of the two sexes, which until then had only one. Okay, so we've gotten to the point of people creating families and staying together, whereas previously they just went off on their own, and they're cooperating. And he says, women became more sedentary and grew accustomed to watch over the hut and the children. That would go with their lactation, basically. It would go with their ability to feed the child. So if the child is going to stay with them and people have learned how to cooperate, it only makes sense that they will make the home their primary responsibility, whatever it is. He says the hut, right? Because they have to be there a lot anyway. They have to be sedentary quite a bit to take care of their children, while men went to seek their common subsistence. So it made more sense, since men didn't have that role of nature of feeding children, to go out and do the hunting. Okay, makes sense. So far, so good. So he says, with their slightly softer life, the two sexes also began to lose something of their ferocity and vigor. And that's interesting because he's saying both male and female have a slightly softer life. Okay, men are going to be stronger than women the more they hunt and the more women stay home. But men are also getting softer, weaker, because now they're cooperating. They don't have to go and leap on the rabbit or whatever. They can, make a plan, and they're out there with their spears, and just things become easier the better they get at this. And no one has to work as hard because of their cooperating. So as they get weaker, the necessity of cooperating grows. They go hand in hand. It's kind of a vicious circle. He says, but while one separately became less suited to combat savage beasts, on the other hand, it was easier to assemble in order to jointly resist them. Okay, each one separately became less suited. You became less able to defend yourself as an individual, but you became more capable of getting together and planning. And this is the very, whiff of government starting here. Just a very little whiff of it. They don't have this notion yet of government, but now, we get together for meetings, perhaps, tribal meetings or whatever, to make decisions, okay? At this point where the family has formed and where people are cooperating, he says something you wouldn't expect. He says, a different type of love develops, conjugal, which is marital love, or in this case, they wouldn't be married yet, but he means, male and female getting together and staying together. Conjugal love and parental love develop, and he says these are the sweetest sentiments known to man. So remember what he said previously last week when we, looked at, male-female love and total state of nature. There is no such thing, right? And it sounds, he makes it sound great. People just act on their, urges at the moment, and then they go away and they don't have outsized desires. And he says outsized desires cause conflict, so they don't have a lot of conflict because they're not lusting after each other's, mates and whatnot. But now he says that conjugal and parental love are the sweetest sentiments known to man. Is there a contradiction there? Why do you think he says this?
Have we officially taken the exit out of the state of nature?
Well, almost. We're halfway. We're halfway. We don't totally exit nature, I think, until we get to private property. But we're making the steps. Yes. This is what I'm thinking, Rousseau, Rousseau's line of demarcation, but you're right. I mean, there's a great deal of cooperation and roles, so you could certainly put it back at this point.
I feel like he says this because it's like the first relationship, and so it's very, very base, and there's not a whole bunch of complications in it, I guess, and that would be, that it's not mucked up with property, it's not, there's not a whole bunch of ties between the two individuals,
Right.
But it's like, it's that first experience man has, basically.
Yeah, it's right at the point where these comparisons are starting to happen, but they haven't gotten to the point of outright conflict yet. People are just noticing and observing, but you don't have jealousy and suspicion and all of these things yet. So again, I mean, this is all, in a way, it's all very ideological. He's setting this up in the way that he wants to in order to make his point about at what point did we go wrong, okay? And it's definitely at the point of property, and even before that, when people start to fight over their differences. But at this point, we haven't quite gotten there, and I think he wants to make a distinction between good love of spouse and child versus what it becomes in society, in true society, okay?
Is he trying to keep people in the state of nature then?
He's trying to get people to compare what they have in civilized society
Right now,
with
okay.
this. Yeah.
So they can go back to this.
Yeah, so they can
Okay.
try to go back to this so that they can maybe reevaluate their marriages and relationships and their relation to their children. Because if you think about it, okay, the elite French, let's say Parisian of his day that he would have been dealing with, would have lived in a very swanky house or castle of some kind, would have had servants, maybe, of course, married and children, but maybe he doesn't see his wife very often because she's doing her own thing and she's got her own boyfriends and he's got his girlfriends, and they don't see their children a whole lot because they've got a nanny to take care of them. And if they think of their children, it might be in terms of, well, what are they learning? Are they being tutored properly? Are they going to be ready to step into the role of the, whatever family name? And if they think about their wife, it's going to be, is she looking good? Does she have the appropriate talents? Is she a good hostess? Is she embarrassing me in any way? At this time, affairs were rather frequent occurrence amongst these people, but they did have to kind of be discreet about it. So, is she embarrassing me in any way is a real good question. And so, at that point, where is the love? Even with the girlfriends and boyfriends, it's lust, but there's not necessarily any real love there. So where is it? Where has it gone? And in its place, there's all these bad feelings, and feelings of stress, my reputation, my name, my land, my, what people think of me, right? Back here, it's just, you're nice to have around, why don't we do this again for another day? This is nice, I like it, that's it. And you do this, I'll do that, we'll come home at the end of the day and we'll be fine, so it's simpler. And I think he wants to remind people, this is what a relationship is actually supposed to be like. Okay, we're out of time, so we'll pick back up with that on Wednesday.